The rain had been falling all afternoon, thick sheets of water hammering the car roof as Elara leaned her head against the window. 17 years old, pale as the glass she pressed against, she felt the familiar ache of disappointment settling into her stomach. Every summer, her friends went camping at the lake, bonfires and laughter glowing across her phone's endless feed of photos. And every summer, her mother shipped her off to her grandmother's cabin in the woods. The forest blurred past in streaks of black and green. Pines lined the road like an army of watchmen, their tops swallowed by the storm clouds. Even in daylight, they looked ancient, untouchable, and unfriendly. Her grandmother's voice crackled from the driver's seat. "You've grown taller," the old woman said, eyes never leaving the winding road. Her voice was rough, the kind that carried warnings in every syllable. "But you look thinner. You must eat. The woods, they take energy from you." Elara forced a laugh. "They're just trees, Grandma. Not vampires." The old woman didn't laugh. Her grip tightened on the wheel. "They are older than you know, older than me, older than anything. Do not stray at night. Do not follow voices." Elara rolled her eyes, but something in her grandmother's tone slid beneath her skin. A shadow of seriousness, like words spoken from experience rather than folklore. The car shuddered to a halt in front of the cabin. The sight made Elara's stomach sink further. The cabin sagged into the earth, its wooden panels warped from years of rain. A single lantern flickered on the porch, casting more shadow than light. The surrounding trees pressed in too close, their roots clawing toward the foundation like skeletal fingers. When she stepped out, the air slapped her face, cold, damp, and carrying a faint odor of rot hidden beneath pine. She pulled her jacket tighter and followed her grandmother inside. The interior smelled of cedar smoke and dust. Crooked shelves lined with jars of herbs leaned against the walls. A single clock ticked above the mantel, its sound heavy, like a heartbeat. "Your room is upstairs," the old woman said. "But first, eat. You need strength." The stew on the table was thick, dark, and fragrant. Elara forced spoonfuls past her lips, though the metallic aftertaste made her throat itch. Her grandmother barely touched hers, sipping only at the broth, her eyes darting toward the window every few minutes, as if something might be staring back. That night, Elara lay in her bed beneath a quilt that smelled faintly of mildew. The rain had stopped, but the forest outside was alive. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted, branches groaned. Yet amid the ordinary sounds, there was something else, a scratching, slow, deliberate, against the wood of the house. She froze, clutching the blanket to her chin. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might drown out the noise. But the scratching continued, not frantic like a raccoon, not curious like a squirrel. No, this was something purposeful. She pushed herself up and crept toward the window. Her breath fogged the glass. Beyond the pane stretched the forest, pitch black, swallowing the moonlight whole. She was about to close the curtain when she saw them. Eyes, 2 points of faint light, glimmering unnaturally pale, set too far apart to be human, too high to belong to any animal she knew. They didn't blink. They didn't sway. They only watched. Elara stumbled back, her heel catching the edge of the rug. She fell against the nightstand, the lamp clattering to the floor. When she looked again, the eyes were gone. Her breathing slowed only when exhaustion dragged her back beneath the quilt. But even as sleep pulled at her, she heard something whispering faintly against the walls. Not words, not quite. More like the forest itself murmuring in a language she wasn't meant to understand. The morning sun offered little comfort. Her grandmother brewed tea, her hands trembling as she poured. Elara wanted to ask about the eyes, about the scratching, but the memory felt fragile, like a dream that might collapse if spoken aloud. Instead, she asked, "Grandma, do you hear things at night?" The old woman's spoon froze midway to her lips. "You must promise me something, Elara. she said slowly, voice thin with fear. After sundown, do not go near the windows. Do not open the door. And if you hear your name, do not answer. Elara's throat went dry. Why would I hear my name? Her grandmother didn't answer. She only stared into her tea as though searching for truths in the dark liquid. Later that afternoon, Elara wandered to the edge of the clearing. The forest loomed, darker in daylight than it should have been. She hesitated at the tree line, then stepped inside. The silence was immediate. No birdsong, no rustle of small creatures. Only the sound of her own footsteps on the damp earth. Something tugged at her attention, a smell drifting on the air, metallic, foul. She followed it, pushing aside low branches, until she stumbled upon it. A deer carcass. Its body was twisted unnaturally, the legs bent backward as if snapped and rearranged. The chest cavity was hollow, emptied of organs, the ribs spread open like broken wings. Black veins crawled from the wounds across the fur as though the rot itself had roots. Elara gagged and stumbled back, hand pressed to her mouth. Then, a crack of a branch behind her. She spun, her flashlight app clumsy in her shaking hand. The beam cut through the trees. Nothing. Only trunks and shadows. But the feeling of being watched was unmistakable, heavy as a hand pressing against the back of her neck. She ran all the way back to the cabin, her breath tearing at her lungs. That night, she tried to convince herself it was only a predator, wolves maybe, or bears. But when she pulled the curtain aside, she saw them again. The eyes. Still, watching. Her grandmother's voice drifted from the doorway. Don't look at it, Elara. Close the curtains. Elara's hand shook as she obeyed. Her grandmother's whisper was so faint, Elara almost missed it. It knows when you see it. And when it knows, it never forgets. The second night was colder. The old cabin seemed to have absorbed something from the storm and kept it, a chill dampness that rose from the floorboards and crept into Elara's bones. She wore socks to bed and a sweater beneath the quilt, but the cold stayed with her. Not a seasonal cold, not the ordinary bite of mountain air, but the kind that belonged to deep places where the sun had never reached. She lay perfectly still and listened to the house breathe. The crickets were softer than the night before, their chorus thinned to a staccato ticking that came and went like a memory. There were long stretches of nothing, as if the woods were holding their breath, and in those intervals the cabin's little noises became enormous. The old clock on the mantel thumped steadily through the floor. A loose shutter tapped from time to time like a polite knuckle. Pipes flexed. Rafters sighed. Elara tried to count the breaths between each sound, to make a pattern of them, something she could hold and name. Then she heard her name. It came from the wrong place. Not the window, not the hall, not the stairs. It came as if from beneath the bed, then from within the wall, then from the air itself, so close she felt it on her cheek. Elara. Soft as a feather. Elara. Urgent but distant, a voice spoken through wet cloth. She sat up too quickly and the blood rushed from her head. The whisper came again, just at her ear, Elara. Her grandmother's warning grabbed at her like a hand. Do not answer. She kept her mouth closed, lips pressed together so tight she tasted iron. The whisper persisted. Sometimes it sounded like her mother, and for 1 second she almost spoke back. But the way it elongated the second syllable, Lara, was wrong, like it was practicing. A long scrape traveled across the siding below her window, the slow drag of something with weight and patience. She crept toward the curtain. Her fingers hovered at the edge of the fabric. She didn't want to look, but not looking felt worse. She lifted a corner and peered into the black. At first, there was nothing but her reflection, a pale oval on the glass. Then her eyes adjusted, and the trees congealed into shapes. Trunks, limbs, the suggestion of a path. Rain had left the ground slick. One of the porch lanterns burned low, its flame a dull seed. Something moved. It was not the graceful motion of a deer, not the scuttle of a fox. It was a slow unfolding, like a white spider unbending each leg, except what uncurled was taller than the porch roof and thinner than any living trunk. It stepped into the weak lantern glow and stopped just at the edge of the light, so that most of it was swallowed, but a portion of its arm, if that's what it was, caught the glow and held it like milk. In glass. The surface pulsed faintly, not quite translucent, as if veins swam just beneath. It bent at a hinge that wasn't a joint and cocked its head in a way that made Elara's neck itch. Two lights blinked open, high and far apart. Not eyes, she told herself. Not anything human enough to be called eyes. Yet when they found her window, she felt the sudden and indescribable certainty of being perceived. The whisper in the room softened. "Elara," it said, almost tender, almost proud. She dropped the curtain like it burned. She backed to the bed and curled her toes into the quilt as if she might anchor herself with the fabric. The whisper swelled, then receded, as if the voice were testing the edges of the room. Somewhere in the kitchen, a glass clicked delicately against another. The house shifted from foot to foot. She forced herself to count the clock's beats until the whisper faded, until the only sound was the thinning crickets and the old shutter tapping. Her jaw ached from clenching. She lay down without undressing and slept without knowing she had. In the morning, she found the marks. They began below the window and ran down the siding in 4 deep grooves, each groove as wide as a finger and twice as deep. The wood had splintered in long, curling ribbons that hung like papery tongues. The smell that rose from the cuts turned her stomach, the sweet metallic stench she'd followed in the trees. Her grandmother stood on the porch with a mug so hot the steam beaded in her lashes, but she seemed not to notice. Her mouth was a thin white line. "You looked," the old woman said. It was not a question. Elara lifted a shoulder. It felt childish to deny it. "I heard something." "You will hear many things here," her grandmother said, and her voice had none of the scolding Elara expected. It sounded tired. "And not all of them are outside." Elara opened her mouth to demand an explanation, to ask who or what was not human anymore, as her grandmother had said, to ask why the woods were so silent. But the questions felt like seeds in her throat, dry and hard. When she tried to speak, they stuck and would not travel up. The old woman reached out and touched the marks with the back of her fingers, as if the grooves might bite. "It knows your name," she said, so softly Elara might have imagined it. "And now it knows your face." Elara spent the day trying to be ordinary. She chopped carrots with a knife that needed sharpening. She cleaned a shelf and sneezed 6 times from the dust. She fetched eggs from the coop and watched a fat hen blink slowly at her, its eye like a lacquered seed. Her grandmother measured flour and salt with a care that bordered on ritual. The clock never lost its place. The normal tasks were a string across a chasm, and Elara walked them carefully, toes curled around each one. The sun took an hour to slide behind the trees, and when it did not go all at once. It dripped away like oil, leaving a stain of gray that clung to everything. Elara lit the lanterns herself and felt braver for doing it. The walls breathed. The glass of the windows darkened. She ate stew and bread and made herself chew each bite 12 times, the way a teacher had once instructed to calm a roomful of 8-year-olds. She took her plate to the sink and washed it and dried it and held it a second too long before placing it on the rack. The first knock came while her hands were still damp. It was soft at first, almost polite. 3 measured taps on the front door. Elara's grandmother looked up so quickly her neck cracked. The old woman's face emptied of color. The second set of taps came a little louder. Then a third. Then the handle turned just a fraction, then stopped. The fourth knock shook the frame. "Do not answer it," her grandmother said. She did not whisper. She spoke as if she were reading a line written on the air and could not deviate. Her hands fluttered once at her sides and then vanished into her sleeves. "Do not look out. Do not speak." The fifth knock slammed like a fist. The lantern nearest the door flickered hard, a moth battering itself against yellow glass. The door trembled. A long exhale pressed through the seam and carried with it the smell of cold iron and old, wet wood. Elara inched backward until her calves met a chair. The knocking stopped. The silence left after it was not relief. It was anticipation. Something moved across the roof. The boards above them bowed as weight distributed from one side of the cabin to the other. The sounds were wrong. Not footsteps, not the skitter of an animal. The movement was a dragon lift, a sticky unlatching and readhering, like something peeling itself off and on as it went. The lanterns did not flicker now. They burned too steadily, halos tightening against their wicks. Elara could not help it. She looked up. Something slick pressed against the ceiling between two beams, a bulge that traveled above them and left a darker stain in its wake, as if moisture had passed through the wood in an instant. Her grandmother's lips moved soundlessly. Elara could not tell if she prayed. The bulge paused. The house exhaled, long and slow. There was a soft, wet sound like cloth wrung between hands, and dust sifted down from a seam. Elara flinched and swallowed a cough. The bulge moved again, then stopped above her bedroom. She knew it without knowing. She felt the recognition in the place behind her eyes where the whispers had crowded. The whisper came again, muffled by the ceiling, as if the voice were speaking into her mattress from above. Elara. The room was suddenly too bright. Every grain in the wood was a cut, every nailhead a pupil. She pressed her palms to her ears, but her name traveled through bone and blood. The door to the hall creaked as if a draft had found it, and she wanted nothing more than to run through it, to put every room between her and that voice. Her grandmother spoke then, aloud, in a tone Elara had never heard from her. It was neither gentle nor fearful, but something like an instructor's in a class that could not afford mistakes. "It is not a thing you can reason with," the old woman said. "It is not a person. It is not a spirit that bargains. It is a hunger that learned to wear a form. You cannot give it what it wants because it wants the wanting. Do you understand? Sit, breathe. Do not answer your name." Elara nodded despite the fact that the old woman wasn't looking at her. Her grandmother's hands were still hidden in her sleeves, but Elara could see them tremble beneath the fabric. The thing on the roof shifted again, heavier now, as if it had gathered itself. The ceiling creaked. A hairline crack opened between planks and widened enough that Elara could see a seam of black so pure it had no depth. She could not tell if the wood receded or if something pushed from the other side. The lantern flame beside the clock hissed and steadied. The scene closed with a flex like a held breath released. The weight moved to the far corner, paused for a long measuring minute, and then went, peeling itself back toward the porch and away, the drag diminishing until only her pulse thundered in. Her wrists? They sat at the table until the clock struck midnight, neither speaking, neither pretending to be doing anything else. When at last her grandmother rose, she moved like someone who had passed through a narrow place and was afraid to find another. She set a lock on the front door that Elara had not seen before, a pretty iron thing carved with circles that nested within circles. When she turned it, a shiver ran across Elara's scalp as if the air had been combed. "Sleep," the old woman said. "Dream if you must, but do not follow anything in the dream that wears the shape of your mother. It has learned that voice. It will learn more." Elara climbed the stairs with her heart in her mouth. At the top step, she hesitated and looked back. Her grandmother had extinguished 3 of the lanterns and left one burning low in the kitchen. The old woman's face was turned toward the window, where there was nothing to see but their reflections, layered over the night. For one strange instant, Elara had the impression that her grandmother was waiting for someone to appear in the glass. Then the old woman pinched the last lantern and the kitchen went dark. Elara's room smelled faintly of salt, as if someone had washed the wood with seawater. She touched the ceiling where the bulge had traveled and felt only cool pine. She went to the window, then stopped herself, then went anyway. The forest was an arrangement of deeper darks, the path a ribbon of gray. She could not find the eyes. The porch lantern glowed a tired coin. For a moment she felt the guilty disappointment that there was nothing to see. The whisper came from the closet. She did not move, did not turn her head, did not even let her eyes flicker. Elara. A hand could have been an inch from her neck and she would not have known because her body had decided that stillness was survival and had chosen it without asking her. The whisper spilled from the closet as if the door were an open throat. She could feel the slight change in air pressure, the tremor of sound against the hanging clothes. Elara, the voice insisted, then lowered itself into a mimicry of kindness so deft she almost stepped toward it. "Sweetheart," it said, and the word rotted in the middle like fruit. "I found your scarf." Her scarf hung from a nail by the bedroom door. She looked at it so quickly the action hurt. The whisper paused, sensing the lie of itself, then stretched the vowels in her name until syllables thinned and broke. Elara did not know how long she stood there, pinned between window and closet by the yawning mouth of her own name. The clock downstairs ticked out a simple arithmetic of fear. When she could make her legs obey, she crossed the room sideways, never showing her back to the closet, and slid into bed like slipping beneath a door. She pulled the blanket over her head and found that the whisper was louder there, closer to the skull. She pressed her fingers into her ears and hummed a tune from childhood, a nursery rhyme about a fox and a moon. She hummed until the hum was the whole world and there was no closet and no window and no mouth made of her name. She woke to a noise like paper tearing. Brightness pressed her eyes open. Sun had found a break in the trees and poured itself straight into the room. The tear came again, not paper but wood, a thin splinter working free. She sat up. Something lay on the floor just inside the closet door, something small and white. She climbed out of bed with the caution of a cat and peered down. It was a tooth, not human. Too long, too smooth, a conical thing with a faint spiral ridge running its length like a screw. The tip was stained a dull brown. The base was ragged where it had torn free. It smelled like pennies and rain. She did not touch it. She bent until the hair on her forearms brushed it, then straightened. The closet door stood open by a finger's width. She could see the line of dresses, the blue sweater she never wore, the shadowed back where the wall should have been. She should call her grandmother. She should close the door. She should throw the tooth into the trees as if distance could matter. Instead, she went downstairs with the fragile, floating calm that arrives after a night too full of adrenaline, and found her grandmother already awake, the old woman's eyes small with fatigue and char. P was something else. It left this, Elara said, and told the story without letting the smell or the shape of the tooth find their way into her words. Her grandmother listened as if she were learning a recipe. When Elara finished, the old woman exhaled through her nose and nodded once, twice. "Then you are marked," she said, "not a wound, a notice. It has given you a piece of itself so the rest may follow." Elara laughed. She did not mean to. "That sounds like a curse from a fairy tale." "It is older than those tales," her grandmother said, "and less clever. It is hunger with patience. We must give it neither." She folded her hands, and for the first time, Elara noticed a pattern of small, pale scars on the backs of them, little crescents, almost neat. The old woman stood and made tea with movements so precise they erased the tremor in her fingers. "There is a place in the woods where the ground does not take footprints," she said. "A hollow where the air tastes of coin. If you find it and stand there at dusk, you can hear what the world sounded like before it had a mouth." That is where it sleeps when it remembers to. Elara stared. You've seen it, she said, more statement than question. Her grandmother's eyes flicked toward the window as if the trees might be listening. I have seen what it leaves, she said. And I have heard my name said by tongues that do not know words. She set the tea before Elara and did not sit again. Today, we salt the thresholds. You do not step off the path. You do not speak your name aloud. And tonight, when it comes, you will not look at it through glass. The glass is not your friend. Elara wanted to ask what could possibly be a friend here. Instead, she cupped the hot mug and let the steam fog her lashes the way it had her grandmother's. She felt the phantom weight of the tooth in her palm, though she had not touched it, giving a piece to keep the rest from drifting. A notice, a promise. In the late morning, they walked the path around the cabin, the old woman carrying a ceramic bowl of coarse salt. Elara, a jug of something that smelled sharply of sage and citrus. They worked in silence, pouring thin lines across thresholds, dragging salt into the seams around windowsills with the edges of their hands. Elara spilled a little at a corner, and it caught the light in a way that reminded her of the creature's pale arm in the lantern glow. She inhaled sharply. Her grandmother did not look up. By noon, the air had warmed enough to make the smell of the forest rise fat and green. A hawk circled once and vanished. The tooth lay where Elara had left it, a small white contradiction on the floorboards. She fetched a jar from a high shelf, slipped the tooth inside, and screwed the lid down until the thread squealed. Through the glass, it looked less obscene and more like a specimen, something that could be named and filed and forgotten. But when she set the jar on the mantel, the clock ticked pause just long enough to make her heart stumble. Afternoon slid in, soft and deceptive. Elara found herself sinking into a chair by the window despite the warning, drawn by the clarity of the light, the way it made each leaf a blade. She could almost believe in ordinary hours. The path through the trees flirted with visibility and then pulled its hem away. Her grandmother dozed by the cold stove, mouth slightly open, hands finely still. The cabin smelled of salt and sage and cedar and, beneath all that, the quiet, clean musk of sun on wood. Elara's eyes closed. When they opened again, the light had thickened. The shadows that were supposed to lengthen had instead grown denser, as if the dark were coagulating in place. Her grandmother was awake, very awake, looking at her. The old woman's gaze slid, not to the door or the windows, but to the ceiling above Elara's head. Elara did not follow it. She stared back at her grandmother and felt the tiniest drop of cold gather at the nape of her neck and travel down her spine in increments too small to be called a shiver. Dusk, her grandmother said, and the word was both a warning and a measure. That was when Elara heard the first footsteps that were not footsteps at all, coming from a distance that felt nearer than the door, nearer than her own breath, approaching along a path no human had seen. Each drag lift drag mapping the shape of the night to come.